the previous video, we've seen the animation that we are going to eventually create, and we've also taken a look at our markup. And now let's get starting with our animation. So as we mentioned, we are going to animate this using the Web Animations API. And this is a JavaScript API that unlocks the browser's animation engines for developers. So using this, we can create animations similar to CSS animations. However, we're going to have more control so that we can easily manipulate our animations and create more dynamic animations. In the description for this video, I'm going to put you a link to my course, Modern Web Animations, where we're going to discuss the Web Animations API in details, in addition to other topics like scroll-driven animations and the View Transitions API as well. So make sure to check that out. But anyways, let's get started with our animation. And the first thing that we are going to animate is our street. So if we take a look at our final example, of course, as we move, our street is going to be moving. In fact, what is happening here is that the scooter is not moving at all. However, the street is moving, the houses are moving, and therefore we're getting the feeling that the scooter itself is moving. However, the scooter is just positioned in the center of our screen, and only the wheels of the scooter are animating. So what we're going to do is we have here our street in this ground div, and in ground we have street, and in here we have a div with a background image of a linear gradient here, and inside of here we have our street lines. That is also a background image of these street lines that are repeated in the X direction. And this street div has a width of 200 VW. Why? So that we can have some room for our street to create our animation. So here's our street. It has a width of 200 VW, so its width is double the viewport width. So if we add here a translate in the X direction, so let's add, a transform and translate in the X direction. And if we, let's say, added 0% here, we can shift our street in the negative X direction by 50%, like so. And this is going to be the end of our div. If we do more than 50%, we're going to see that we have a gap here. So in our animation, we're going to animate from 0%, so from here, and then we're going to animate until negative 50% so that our street will appear to be moving. And when we reach the end, when we reach negative 50% here, we're going to repeat this animation again so that it will appear as if we have an infinite street. So to demonstrate more, let's imagine that this is our viewport. So this is our screen, for example. And then let's imagine that this is our street, which is taking half of our height, however, double the width, double the viewport width. So what we're going to animate is we're going to animate this street div, and we're going to animate it from 0%. The translate X is going to be 0%, and then we're going to animate it to negative 50% so that it moves from here to here. And then we're going to repeat that infinitely so that we're going to start from here again and end here, start from here again and end here, and so on, so that we can have an infinite animation. Let's first do this using CSS, and then we are going to see how can we do it using the Web Animations API in JavaScript. So let's go in our styles CSS file. Let's go to the part where we style our street, which is here, and let's create an animation, a normal CSS animation. Where we are going to define some keyframes. Let's call it street, and let's animate from, and as we agreed, we're going to animate from transform, translate X 0%, and then we're going to animate to negative 50%. And by having that, we can just apply this animation to our street div like so. So we can have our animation. Let's make it linear. Let's make it infinite, and then let's maybe run it for 5 seconds and supply our animation name here, our keyframe name. By having that, we should have our animation here, and our street is going to be appearing to be moving infinitely. So that's great. However, we need to do this with JavaScript so that, as we agreed, we can control our animation, we can increase the speed, decrease the speed, and so on when we click on certain buttons in our keyboard. So I'm going to remove this. Let's maybe comment it for now. And I'm going to go to my JavaScript file. And what I'm going to do is, to keep things organized, I'm going to create a new folder here. I'm going to call it scripts. And in scripts, I'm going to create a file called street.mjs so that we can import this into our index and have our files organized. So let's import from scripts our street.mjs file. And we don't need this, we just need to import the whole file. And now in here, let's create our animation. So to create an animation using the Web Animations API, we need to define two things. So first of all, we need to define something called the keyframe effect. So let's create a new constant here and let's call it street keyframes maybe. And we have a constructor called keyframe effect. So we can use new here and then keyframe effect. And in here we are going to define something. However, we need to define something else, which is called the animation object. So let's define another constant here. It's called street animation, and then using the animation constructor, we are going to define this animation object. So what are these two things? I have a typo here, animation. So in here, I'm going to also put a link to these docs. We have a nice analogy here to demonstrate the animation and the keyframe effect. So the animation, you can imagine it as a DVD player, and the keyframe effect is the DVD itself. So the DVD contains information, the thing that is going to be played, what each frame is going to look like, the duration of the DVD, and so on. And the DVD player only controls the DVD. So the information is in the DVD, however, we can control it using the DVD player. We can play, pause, we can increase the speed, we can reverse, and so on. So similar to that, you can imagine the keyframe effect being the DVD and the animation object being the DVD player. In the keyframe effect, we're going to define our keyframes, what our animation is going to look like at any point in time, and we are also going to define our duration, our easing, and so on. And using the animation object, we're going to control our animation, play it, pause it, and so on. So to do so, in the keyframe effect, we need to supply the target, the div that we're going to be animating. So I'm going to get my street div in here, and I'm going to use document.query, document.query selector. I'm going to get a div with a class of street here. And then we're going to supply this as a first argument. And then as a second argument, we're going to define our keyframes. And this can be an array of keyframes. So in here, we can have an array. And for each array, we can have the things that we would like to animate. So as an object, we can have CSS properties that we need to animate as keys in this object. So in our case, we need to animate the transform. And we need to animate it from translate x of 0. And then we need to animate it to translate x of -50. So we can add another keyframe here in our array of objects and add our -50. And of course, as you know, in CSS, from and to are going to correspond to 0% and 100%. However, we can make this, for example, 20%, right? To do this in the JavaScript Web Animations API, we can supply an offset here. However, this is going to be a number from 0 to 1, so 20% is going to correspond to 0.2, for example. However, we don't need that in our animation. We need it to we need this to be at 0%, and this is going to be at 100%, and this is going to happen by default if you do not specify any offset. Your keyframes are going to be spread evenly. So if you have 3 keyframes, they're going to be 0, 50%, and 100%, and so on. And then at the third argument, we can specify our duration. So let's say 5 seconds. Over here is going to be in milliseconds, so 5000 milliseconds. We can also have our easing, so let's add linear here. We can have our iterations. We need to make this animation infinite. However, unlike CSS, this is not going to be infinite, it's going to be the JavaScript infinity keyword here. So this is going to be our keyframe effect. And now for our animation object, which you can think of it as the DVD player, what we need to do is only supply it with our keyframe effect as a first argument that we defined above. And as a second argument, we can have a timeline. So we can have document the timeline here, and this is our default timeline. So document the timeline is the time-based timeline. However, we can also have scroll-based timelines. However, that's another topic that we also discuss in my course if you'd like to check it out. But now, let's also console log these things, the keyframe, the street keyframes, and the street animation object. And let's take a look at them in the browser as well. If we now save and go back to our browser, nothing is going to happen. Why? Because we need to, after defining our keyframe effects and our animation object, we need to play our animation by calling streetAnimation.play. And now, as you can see, we have our animation running. And now if we take a look at our console to see our animation object, sorry, I have a typo here. This is console log. As you can see, we have our keyframe effect. And in here we have information, we have our target, for example, the thing that we are animating. And if we take a look at the prototype, we have some methods here. Get keyframes, where we can get our keyframes, set keyframes, where we can update our keyframes. And if we look further, we also have get timing, get computed timing, update timing, where we can manipulate our timing information, which are the things that we pass here, the duration, easing, iterations, and so on. So as you can imagine, we can manipulate anything in our keyframe effects and also in our animation object. Remember, this is the DVD player where we can control our animation, pause it, play it, change the playback rate, and so on. So in here, we have a reference to our effect, our keyframe effect, which we've just seen. And also we have some information. We have the play state, our animation is currently running. We have the playback rate, so on. We have also some promises. This finished promise, for example, is going to resolve when our animation finishes. And if you look in the prototype, we have methods to pause, play, reverse. We have also update playback rate, and so on. So great. One final thing that I would like to mention is, in addition to being able to define our animations like so, we can also define them in another way. So I'm going to comment everything that we've done here. And instead of defining the keyframe effect and the animation object separately, what we can do is we have a method on our elements. So on our street element, for example, we have a method of animate. And this can be a shortcut to creating an animation on an element without having to define the keyframe effect and the animation object separately. And in here, we can pass our keyframes as a first argument. So let's copy them from here, this array of keyframes here. And as a second argument, we can pass our duration properties here. So in our case, we had these, duration, easing, and iterations. And in addition to that, remember we can, when we create the animation object, we can specify the timeline. And now using this shortcut, we can specify this timeline here as well. So we can have timeline and we can have documented timeline. And this is going to be it. We don't have to create the keyframe effect and the animation object separately. And also, our animation is going to be played by default. We don't have to call .play to play our animation. So if we save now, we can see that our animation is running. And also, this is going to return the animation object. So if we store this in a constant, let's call it street animation. This is going to be similar to the street animation that we defined here. And if we need to access the effect, it is going to exist in this animation object. So if we try and console log this, we have our animation object and everything that we've seen before. And we have here the effect if we would like to change something in our keyframe effect that was created when we called .animate. One final thing that I would also like to mention is, now that we have these animations, in our document and also in any separate element, we can access animations that exist in the document or on a certain element. So in our document, we can call get animations. This is going to get all the animations that we have defined in our document, or we can get animations for a certain element like the street, for example. So street get animations. This is going to get all the animations defined on our street element. So if you take a look at here, at our console, so also console log, we're going to have an array of animations. Of course, currently we only have one animation in our entire document, and also the same animation in our street div. This can be very useful if you would like to do something like maybe pausing all of our animation, playing all of our animations, and so on. That's it for this video. However, let's carry on and animate our scooter in the next video.